To introduce today, I'm pleased to say that you've obviously all read the information and know what today is, but it perhaps did not quite emphasise that apart from being a ghost hunting workshop, the combination of both the Society for Psychical Research and the Ghost Club together is something perhaps of a long overdue formal event. There was last a proper unification in activities between the two organisations as long ago as 1886. It is common knowledge that both organisations have existed since the Victorian era. The Ghost Club can claim a descent to the mid-19th century, and from its early activities in Cambridge, these later went on to influence some of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, who were Cambridge scholars. In 1882, those scholars formed the Society for Psychical Research, which continues in its current form here today. We are the heirs to that body from the Victorian forebears. But simultaneously, in November 1882, a meeting took place to found or reform the Ghost Club, an initiative led by the Reverend Stainton Moses, who at the same time had been elected as the Vice President of the Society for Psychical Research. The Ghost Club remained a quieter, private cultural body, it may be said, whereas the Society for Psychical Research was a large open organisation and aiming to be an essentially scientific body. Both had no corporate opinion. Members were free to believe or disbelieve as little as they want, but the two bodies operated initially quite well together in conjunction, and there always has been an overlap of membership. But in 1886, the Reverend Stainton Moses resigned on account of the fact he felt that life after death had been proved, whereas many of the Society for Psychical Research felt that that had not yet been established to a standard that satisfied their scientific and philosophical convictions. And thus there has not been, to the best of my knowledge, a formal meeting of this type ever since. So you are at something of a historic event today. I was almost tempted to say I'll start this as the Ghost Club was saying back in 1886 before it was interrupted, but no, we won't do it that way. I must express first of all thanks to the Society for Psychical Research and to its council for agreeing to this joint meeting, because today's meeting is actually got a common theme. It is a ghost hunting workshop looking particularly at the scientific aspects of ghost hunting. If we go back to a presidential address given to the Society by its president in 1993, Dr. Alan Gould, himself an enthusiastic practical ghost hunter for many years, as well as an academic psychologist, he drew attention to what he felt was a regrettable factor in the investigation of ghosts and the paranormal, that it had seemingly become, whilst very encouragingly a lot of people were taking interest, standards were somewhat slipping amongst the groups and organisations with which he was in touch and which were contacting the Society for Psychical Research. It's worth remembering that ghost hunting as an activity is actually not a scientific based activity, is not actually very old. If we go back to the 19th century, ghost hunting in the type of form that people typically think of today, that is going out to premises that have generated reports of anomalous activity, which people are ascribing to ghosts or hauntings or poltergeists, this is actually a relatively new exercise. In the 19th century, the majority of work done and attempts at scientific validation in this field were actually done in the seance room. Ghosts, spirits were invited to come to you rather than the idea of going out to investigate premises where members of the public were reporting them. There was certainly no shortage of ghost reports and apparitional reports in the 19th century. In fact, still routinely quoted today are the two classic volumes, Phantasms of the Living, volumes 1 and 2, by Myers, collated by Myers, Gurney and Podmore, which were published in 1886, covering some 702 established cases with a degree of sufficient corroboration, they felt, as illustrating examples of so-called crisis apparitions. This was where people became aware of seeing an apparition or some kind of paranormal cognition, which they ascribed to the presence of a friend or a relative whom it was subsequently found was typically dying or had just died within the previous 24 hours. And there were a large number of these one-off experiences. They typically only happened on one occasion, sometimes to more than one witness, that very quickly they compiled a large collection and published it. At the same time, the Society had a less well-known Committee for Haunted Houses, which also began looking into reports of what we would today call hauntings, static premises. They also collected a large number of accounts, but the follow-up work, the degree of corroboration was nowhere near as good as with the two volumes of Phantasms. As a result of these two surveys, the Society for Psychical Research then went on to commission what remains to this day the world's largest ever survey of hallucinatory experiences. The Census of Hallucinations, published in 1894, which had involved questionnaires sent out to some 17,000 people. And the results of that survey remain today as the largest ever poll of a population on its experiences of hallucinations, apparitions, phantasms, and so on, and is sufficiently well regarded even to be quoted in the works of sceptical psychologists. The late Dr. Oliver Sacks, who was a sceptic on psychic matters, nonetheless realised the value of this collection. But in terms of actual going out and investigating, there was very little that went on. Prior to 1870, there had from time to time been attempts by, it was typically learned gentlemen, there were never ladies involved with it owing to the social setup of the time, to go out and investigate particular haunted houses and claims, but these were largely one-off initiatives. From the beginning, late 1890s, the Society began to venture out to haunted premises. It ran into adverse publicity over the investigation of a Scottish mansion known as Ballachin House in 1897 and somewhat backed away from the field. But the major efforts were at the time in testing physical and mental mediums who were, at the time, they were enormously popular and remained the key work of the Society in the next 20 years. So it was really after the First World War that, and the 1930s, that ghost hunting proper took off. And much of the perceptions at the time were very much due to the work of the controversial figure of Harry Price, who belonged to a great many different organisations, including the British and the American Society for Psychical Research. But whatever one's thoughts about Price and how he conducted himself in the media, he nonetheless established psychical research as a science in the popular press and media of the time. Following Price's death in the 1950s, we come into a period where certain members, particularly Tony Cornell of the Cambridge University Society for Psychical Research and Alan Gould, began to take up the question of spontaneous cases, researching them during the 1950s through to the 1980s, and taking an increasingly technical approach. They were joined in their later efforts by the late Andrew Green, who published the world's first popular ghost book, or book on ghost hunting, in 1973. Andrew Green I knew very well. He was an interesting character who often said he was a ghost hunter who did not believe in ghosts. He nonetheless accepted that people had apparitional experiences, experienced strange phenomena, and believed they could be approached in a scientific fashion. He was convinced of the existence of psi phenomena, both from laboratory and spontaneous cases, but he was not a advocate of survival or the idea that ghosts represented some living element of consciousness that was post-mortem, that had survived death. Nonetheless, he also succeeded in getting quite a bit of publicity, as did other ghost hunters. I know that those who work in many who work in spontaneous cases today, feel we very much stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to the activities of these workers in the period. And the idea of scientific ghost hunting was also taken up from 1957 in the United States, particularly by William Roll, who was attached to the Duke Laboratories and was connected with the work of William Rhine, seen as the founder of modern, J.B. Rhine rather, founder of modern parapsychology. And he also undertook investigations to a scientific standard. Well, the principles that were followed did spark a growing number of amateur investigations into ghost hunting around the country. And let me say at the first juncture, there is nothing at all wrong with being an amateur investigator. If there were paid jobs in ghost hunting, I'm sure there would be many applicants. But the fact that somebody adopts or has the status of an amateur in a particular field does not detract from the fact that they can do important and significant work in that particular field or discipline. Good examples are astronomy, archaeology, natural studies, and various cultural researches. The work of amateurs plays a very important part, particularly in field work and field studies and investigations in these fields, as well as in many other ordinary walks of life. If you are qualified as a St John's ambulance man, you may well be only doing it as a part-time or a part-time fireman or a part-time police officer, but you nonetheless fulfil a professional role. So the term amateur is not one to view in a derogatory way. One problem is, of course, that it does actually represent a wider split, which is recognised not just in the field of parapsychology and psychical research, that within many scientific disciplines there is a division between the scholars and the academics and those who actually are practitioners in the field, those who actually go out and do field work, who investigate, and it can be seen, for example, the difference between academic psychology and practical clinical psychology is very large indeed. As I heard the head of the American Psychiatric Association put it in a lecture on the work of Sigmund Freud, he said, well, the problem is the academics know everything and do nothing, and the clinical practitioners do everything but know nothing. This division is there, but it's one that is institutionally set, and it is a problem that is not just confined to parapsychology. And I'm afraid, indeed, I'm glad I was only ever an academic lawyer, for a period and a part-time one of that. I'm glad I don't work in academia these days, seeing what they have to put up with, but that's a personal aside. I'm sure there are many happy academics, but in terms of going out and conducting field work, those who have been experienced, certainly in recent years, with growing and to be encouraged efforts between academia and field investigators have sometimes looked a little askance, and the more enthusiastic and the growing number of participants, the less regard there has been in the general excitement and ballyhoo which can accompany these affairs, less and less interest in both the initial material with which ghost hunters have to work, which is ultimately witness testimony, and furthermore in the standards, if any, of scientific rigour which are applied when equipment is introduced into the environments where ghosts and phenomena are being reported. In the worst cases, I mean, I'm sure most of you have seen these television programmes, we're actually talking about TV shows which are really exercises in practical spiritualism and bear very little relationship, if any, with any serious scientific methodology or inquiry. And it's almost to the point that equipment has been fetishised, and objects of measuring tools, electronic equipment, devices, thermometers, cameras, these are being deployed not in any scientific purpose or manner, but more as ritual objects which are displayed by people who apparently, from their pronouncements and statements, know all the answers anyway. They are convinced already that the phenomena which are recorded represent evidence of discarnate spirit activity and phenomena which are already established, whereas anyone who has any acquaintanceship with the standards of psychical research or parapsychology will know that this remains a hotly disputed field where there are a wide range of opinions and there is no certainty. It is in fact the job of the ghost hunter to try and establish what is going on within the existing paradigms that we have to work with. And in talking about this, I'm not going to really be talking here about the equipment, because there's better qualified and more experienced investigators than myself who can speak on both the use of different equipment or the results which are obtained from equipment. But it is something which concerns me, because I work in a different field in daily life which requires standards of evidence and proof, which is the judicial system. It must be recognised in any scientific inquiry there is a limit to what you can establish by means of laboratories. In the human world, where these kind of spontaneous phenomena occur, we need to introduce different methods to try and find the truth, and to a huge extent legal proceedings rely still on witness testimony and documentation produced by witnesses. And it's also the case with much forensic evidence which is used daily in courts. We can establish, for example, in a case of child abuse, that a child has suffered injuries by using medically recognised tests and procedures. What we cannot establish as easily is if those injuries have been deliberately inflicted by anyone caring for that child. Similarly, in a case of sexual abuse within a family, you may be able to establish that a daughter has been sexually interfered with. In a case where pregnancy results through DNA testing, you can establish a genetic link to somebody else in the family who is linked with the abuse. What you cannot establish, if it's a case of father and daughter abuse and the daughter is over 16, is whether, simply from laboratory tests, whether this represented an act of rape or there was some kind of element of sexual consent. these cases have to be resolved in courts. Indeed, even give an even clearer example, if you had a case of alleged fraud in a laboratory as to the production of results which are faked or spurious, you could not rely solely upon laboratory tests to interpret that evidence as evidence of a deliberate fraud. I mean, it could well be several other things, including negligence or accident, but solely through scientific testing, we would not be able to establish it to a degree of certainty that the law would require for proving any point. And there's frequently arguments between experts in different fields of science which end up in the courtroom, particularly in intellectual property and patents. The law itself is neutral. It does not determine whether scientific theories are right or wrong. It simply just addresses the question of proof. Now, we shouldn't forget witness testimony, because it is what actually begins any investigation into a spontaneous case. If we did not have witnesses who reported cases to us, and said they had seen or encountered or experienced what they interpret as ghosts, we wouldn't have very much at all, it must be said. It all hinges on this. Now, there is no doubt that people do experience what they believe are apparitions. I've seen one for myself. Dare say a fair few of the audience have as well, or they will know somebody reliable who they consider trustworthy and truthful who has reported such an experience. Some of you have looked into them already yourselves to a great degree. Trying to discover what is going on in any case of any haunting or alleged haunting is difficult, because typically these phenomena overlap between objective, that is, phenomena which appear to occur in the world around us, and wholly mental or subjective phenomena. In some ways, the approach of the ghost hunter using scientific techniques and equipment which are based on scientific models and established testing and understanding of the physical world operates best in cases of alleged poltergeist activity. With poltergeist activity, it's characterised by a physical interruption with or interference with the material environment around it. It's characterised by sounds, and there's evidence that these can be be heard on and recorded on tape. And some of the most interesting work done in the last decade has been the work of Dr. Barry Colvin, whose analysis of different poltergeist recordings recorded at different locations over a 40-year period on an international basis on different poltergeist mediums suggests, from simply the acoustic signature analysis, that when a poltergeist makes a rap, it has a different pattern to one which is produced by a manual means of a human being. The signature effect only occurs or is only detectable by way of acoustic analysis. So it is evidence of an effect, given that it is found in many miles apart, many years apart, of, at the moment, a puzzling effect, which suggests that when witnesses said we heard something rapping, which we attributed to the ghost, poltergeist or whatever, there was indeed something anomalous going on, which is now actually detectable by instrumentation. This kind of work is what is the ideal in scientific evidence, because we have an objective phenomena which can be studied by objective scientific techniques and means. You can create tests, models, it can be explored. Most importantly, there is potential for replication by any sufficiently aware investigators who are going out to a situation where a haunting reports noises, strange phenomena, crashing sounds, footsteps, things which are potentially recordable on tape. This is an interesting sort of analysis. Unfortunately, many who approach ghost hunting, or whilst one admires their enthusiasm, there is a lack of understanding both of the subject of psychical research and, more importantly, of the wider scientific paradigm of accepted material science in which these things take place. And so opportunities for obtaining what is potentially cogent or significant evidence are being lost by effectively by mistake, by ignorance and sloppy recording techniques. As I said, I think poltergeist and alleged poltergeist phenomena offer probably the best opportunities for physical ghost hunting. It used to be certainly a pattern of thought from the 1930s, even earlier, was that hauntings could be distinctly divided from occasions where phenomena, hauntings, ghosts, apparitions were distinct to the poltergeist phenomena. It must be said that reviewing the testimony, looking more deeply into cases, that distinction cannot really be maintained as strongly as it once was. Dr. Alan Gould's own analysis of poltergeist activity, 500 poltergeist cases between the 17th century and 1979, indicated through a cluster analysis of the details, it indicated that there are in fact two distinct types of poltergeist category. There is the person-centred poltergeist, which is short-lived, which accounts for 76%, but there's also a remarkable 24% where the phenomena is closer to a traditional haunting and involves the change in occupants in dwellings, but the phenomena also include physical phenomena, object movements, noises, and so on. So he accepted that they can appear to be certain place-centred poltergeists. One hears about them a lot in accounts of haunted pubs. So mixtures of mixed haunts are something that one has to look out for as a ghost hunter, and in fact one must be prepared to be surprised. I've gone to haunted premises where everything I've been led to believe was largely to do with apparitions, only to have unexplained physical phenomena start occurring. And this raises all kinds of potential issues, but at the heart of it, we've got to go back to witnesses and try and make sense of their testimony as best we can. You've also got to be able to eliminate, when you get witness testimony, eliminate possibilities of other causes before you leap in and declare that every person who believes they have seen or experienced a ghost has done so. I give a list here of things which can distort testimony. Misperception of natural stimuli, all kinds of bad plumbing, bad radiators, rodent infestation, beetle infestation, all kinds of things in the natural environment may potentially lead people to believe they are haunted. Autosuggestion, false memories and wishful thinking, hoaxes and lying. These are things to think for. I'm afraid people do tell lies. We don't just find it in the courts but in daily life. Some people like the attention it brings upon them. Intoxication at the time of the experience. Is the person who's reporting phenomena likely to be medicated, intoxicated? One of the most revealing questions I remember being encouraged years ago by Andrew Green to raise discreetly is, particularly when you receive a report of something absolutely extraordinary, quite unlike the general run-of-the-mill phenomena, is to ask the question, can I contact your doctor? If the person seriously believes it is genuine, there is usually no hesitation. For people who are perhaps fall into an intermediate zone of thinking there might be something, welcoming the attention, but also knowing deep down that they are not quite so sure that their phenomena is real, those people tend to be reluctant. I quite understand people may not want to disclose their medical records, but it is a sensitive one has to take a sensitive approach to this. But it can be quite revealing if you can find out the medical history. Furthermore, the medical history in itself, I would say, can also be significant. We know from history of many mediums, from many people who have strange phenomena occurring around them, that unusual medical conditions are present in some of the reports. One of the failings of ghost hunting investigation into poltergeists, when one looks at the historical record going back to the 19th century, is that all too often these factors have been overlooked. Quite often quite interesting medical conditions are reported on the part of witnesses, but no real attempt is taken to explore them. Now, medication, physical disability, illness, also pressure from other people to confirm or deny certain things is present. One has to, if one is visiting cases, one of the best bits of advice I had was from the chairman of the Ghost Club, Tom Perrott, who was a member of the Society for Psychical Research as well. When I asked him about ghost hunting equipment, he said, well, usually it's a notebook, a pencil and a sympathetic ear. One must be prepared to listen, all kinds of and also if you're able to do it, subject to any provisos of confidentiality, security and appropriateness these days, is try to interview witnesses separately from one another as a golden rule, including children. And to an extent you may get very different stories from different members of the household once one of them is on their own and separated from a person who may be influencing their testimony. I would not attempt to medically diagnose these myself, but for example there are also a range of disorders and conditions on the mental health spectrum which can lead people to tell all kinds of strange stories. There's a whole range of things. If you come across cases like this, the best advice is to refer, as I do, refer the case to a doctor or a qualified medical practitioner, psychologist, psychiatrist, as the case may be. Don't try to get involved with their condition at all. This is one area where I'm afraid to say there are, I suspect, a great many problems being contributed by people who are setting themselves up as spirit practitioners and telling people who've got quite often quite serious symptoms of one condition or another that they're in fact beset by ghosts, spirits, demons or reincarnation trauma. And there's a whole movement about this which has grown up in this country, which I have to say is a cause of concern. One more reason why, if you're going to investigate spontaneous cases in people's homes, it needs to be done to existing established scientific and medical paradigms. Then, of course, what's called in the clinical sense iatrogenic disease. This is where the investigators themselves cause the actual symptoms or encourage them. And I have been to households myself where occupiers have been terrified by previous waves of would-be investigators telling them that their house is possessed by evil fiends. As I said to them, I said to one couple in 2013, I mean, I'm not talking about Peterborough Borough Council here. They had been told they had, for example, a demon laughing in the loft. Furthermore, they had a recording of a demon laughing, and they gave me a copy of the tape, which was then subject to analysis by a plumber who diagnosed the 6-second rasping noise interpreted as a laugh followed by a 20-second interval as simply a broken lavatory system in need of attention. But they've been terrified of this demon in the loft. The lady in the house was also being repeatedly assaulted, she maintained, by a male spectre, 7 foot tall, which came down the stairs and took unwarrantable liberties with her of a night time. She then proposed that I might set up a camp bed with her next to it to watch its next predicted assault that night. Well, you can imagine the dilemma it put me in is, what if this actually turned up? Could one sit back as the detached scientific observer and let this entity wreak its havoc, or should one try to get involved or intervene? As you might imagine, at this point, I, in the best news of the world tradition, made my excuses and left, saying that if ever we were going to attempt something such as this, I would aim to have with me a minimum of at least one qualified female practitioner in medicine. I got home 2 hours later from writing up my notes on this to receive a telephone call to say that the ghost was very angry and was now scratching her, and that scratch marks had appeared on her body. Would I come back? To which point I said, no, at this point I think you'd better go and seek medical treatment. If you're being injured, you must go and see your doctor as soon as possible. And indeed, her contact with the SPR was one of, she was, these do exist, a person obviously had some number of issues, who was a serial reporter to different organisations as far away as, including as the United States and Norway, of alleged phenomena going on in her house. So one does have to be careful. I don't think she had been helped, and talking to her half-brother, who was also present, they had both been terrified, however, by people who were telling them that their house was occupied by spirits and possession and so on. At the same time, they were peculiarly enjoying it in some way. And also be prepared for previous investigators to have made mistakes. Facts always have to be checked. Received testimony ought to be checked out and verified, certainly if you're going to try and bring something up to an acceptable standard. Note any distress. As I've said, psychological conditions are important. McHarg, psychiatrist, Scottish Dr. P. McHarg, was a psychiatrist who accepted the reality of psi phenomena in psychiatric patients, but said that and said that the reality of some psi phenomena is attached to people with psychiatric conditions. You should not simply disbelieve them, but the fact they have got strange psi phenomena is going on around them can actually be an indication of an underlying condition or problem. Maurice Grosse, the late Maurice Grosse, said to me something very similar. He said, every case of a poltergeist I've ever been to look into, there was always underlying stress in the household. One of the facts that was not publicised at the time by either Guy Playfair or Maurice Grosse with the Enfield case was at the peak of the activity, the younger brother of Janet, who was the presumed focus of the poltergeist, was in and out of care. He was actually suffering from testicular cancer and died aged 15. So one can imagine that the household was under a huge amount of stress, and when you actually take a step back from the reports of psi phenomena, which were continuous over a period of 9 months and spread on for the best part of 18 months, one realises that this was an extremely stressed, unhappy household with all kinds of issues going on, including with the mother Peggy. Problems with testimony, of course, as well, is that people see all kinds of things in haunted premises. If you give them the idea the premises are haunted, this has been a problem with seances over the years, led Podmore to basically renounce spiritualism, and also to I have to, for those of you who don't know the history of Frank Podmore, do read him, whether you're a sceptic or believer. If you're interested in poltergeists, Frank Podmore in 1896 gave what still remains the most impressive and best researched rebuttal of the existence of poltergeist phenomena yet published. Although sceptics may berate the existence of poltergeists, no one has actually come closer to Podmore's attempts to discredit testimony, though some of his later theories as to what accounted for poltergeist phenomena do rather get into the absurd, such as his suggestions that this is the early 20th century, that people were smoking cannabis at the time, including police officers, in order to, and that explains their hallucinations of objects falling slowly. Podmore, who it must be said also, when one reads his work closely, didn't actually like adolescent girls at all. In fact, one don't think he actually liked women very much with some of his sayings and statements. Considers that women were essentially untrustworthy and had been ever since for the witch trials, which he didn't even seem to think that the witch trials were necessarily a terrible injustice. And of course, you'll run into the problem that as well that will be told. And this, of course, is a familiar refrain from sceptical psychologists, that eyewitnesses are subject to inaccuracies. Well done, anomalous psychology. Before psychology even began in the 1870s, there were already well-established bar textbooks for barristers saying that witness testimony can be unreliable. Particularly if it's unreliable, it can be particularly unreliable for children. Well done, welcome to common knowledge. Less commonly recognised by anomalous psychologists who will try and tell you we cannot accept witness testimony as valid proof is the fact the whole subject of assessing witnesses by way of psychology was actually promoted originally in 1900 by Baron Schrenck-Notzing, who was a founder of psychology but also a most enthusiastic psychical researcher who spent the last 30 or so years of his life dedicating himself to investigating psychic phenomena. And what a skeptic who tells you that we cannot rely on witness testimony will never say is that we cannot rely on all witness testimony. It is only because some witness testimony is at its heart reliable we can ever say that any is unreliable. So although they say this may be possible that the witness was wrong, well, that's something to consider, and I've given 11, 12 good reasons why, but at the same time you can never say that all witness testimony is wrong. And the accumulation of evidence from witnesses over many years, many miles apart, is in fact, and has been since the 1890s, a recognised evidential method for proving things that happen outside the laboratories. It's a doctrine in law known as similar fact evidence. Basically, human behaviour falls into patterns and individual behaviour can fall into patterns. Without going into a full lecture on similar fact evidence is routinely used in sexual abuse cases, sexual offences and cases of serial killing, where there are no witnesses, or there may only be the witness who is the complainant, where you have accounts many miles apart, many years apart. A good example is the Rolf Harris convictions. You might disbelieve one complainant, but when you have a score many miles apart who've never had a chance to come together to corroborate their testimony, that is recognised by the law and has been since the 1890s as probative. As was said in one case, Rhys Smith in 1915, to have one wife drown in the bath is a tragedy. To have a second wife drown in the bath after having been recently insured is an even greater tragedy and terrible thing. The third time it happens, it's murder. when point I'm just leading into, which I think John Fraser will also pick up on, is that this similar fact testimony, evidence to a standard which would be acceptable in the courtroom, certainly can be found in the better attested investigation cases. Certainly some of the poltergeist cases, the one line that the Guardian wouldn't print in 2015, when I was approached for a quote about the series The Enfield Haunting, was when I said there was more evidence of the Enfield poltergeist than the crimes that Rolf Harris had just been convicted of. And with due respect to any anomalous psychologists in the audience, because it is a valid discipline and can bring useful insights, I would actually say that if we also make sure we do analyse witness testimony, evidence from individuals, we can start to come to some scientifically interesting ideas and possible hypotheses from analysing testimony closely. We can find ways in which can actually, possible patterns, which raise the prospect of developing theories and experimentation, ways to confirm the activity in future cases, which can be of scientific value to help with the methodology. Using the word phenomenology here, phenomenology is the study of consciousness, the structures of consciousness, the close examination of the experiences that people report in terms of what it is telling us about their consciousness. There's clearly a subjective element to apparitional experiences. Some people see them, some people don't. Animals appear to react to apparitions, which humans may not all see. There is scope I think here for anyone, it doesn't really matter if they take a materialist paradigm or not on psi phenomena, to look at what is being reported in the minds of witnesses, what is going on in terms of perceptual experiences when a ghost is seen. I list here possible issues to look at. Typically people who see ghosts are talking about changes in concentration. You ask them what they're doing. Typically people are relaxed. In a third of the cases recorded by the SPR in the 1880s, the person who saw the ghost was in bed at the time. There's issues of attention, memory, judgment, all kinds of things. Sometimes when people have strange experiences, archaic modes of thought start coming back. People start thinking in terms of magic or witchcraft or some kind of strange occult happening, what we would class as archaic or primitive forms of thought. Their sense of reality is challenged. Obviously, ordinary concepts of Western cause and effect are called into question if, like PC Caroline Heach, you suddenly see a chair move across the kitchen of 284 Green Street in Enfield. All kinds of things. You often disturb time sense. People talk about time standing still. Something, it seems to be occurring when you start to see these patterns in many reported cases. Some of these may suggest some kind of dissociation. Changes in the way people react. Some people are terribly scared, feel fear. Other people feel some kind of comfort or relief from a sense of a presence. Perceptual disturbances. Are these hallucinatory aspects? Is something going on in the brain at the time when people report luminosities, sparks, all kinds of visual effects? What was the witness thinking about at the time is always an interesting question. Very rarely are they ever talking about or thinking about ghosts. This may explain one of the reasons why ghost hunters are often quite spectacularly unlucky in failing to see ghosts. They've got it on the mind. Once they are in a state of relaxation, not exactly paying attention, it occurs. Loss of control in these stories, and this may be one of the problems we have in approaching this data, is that anybody who tells you a ghost is seen a ghost creates something which is centre stage. Invariably the investigator will start to record details of the apparition, will not necessarily notice aspects of the witness who is telling them, which may be significant. People often report them being unsettling to say the least. Meaning or significance, that could be of importance. What else is going on in the life of the witness at the time? Does this ultimately have an effect, an impact on subsequent work to try and verify what's being said? Time of the experience. This is something again open to scientific analysis. Nobody sees a ghost at breakfast time. None of the reports ever seem to begin, I was eating my cornflakes when I saw. But as the day goes up, the frequency of sightings going up, peak between midnight and 5 a.m. Now, to me, this opens up possibilities that brain chemistry is different at night, during the day. This is something that could be opened up to proper scientific investigation. To the limited extent we can study the brain using modern neurophysiological techniques. And it's there in the folklore. You know, the ghost walks at midnight, it vanished at cockcrow. The whole thing is consistent with a large body of experience. And maybe we should think differently, because people still hold on to, and again, it's a sign of the built-in biases and perceptions that humans have, judgments, that people still tend to think of spirits as things, and that ghosts must be spirits. I mean, it's certainly a long-established technique. Tony Cornell, who looked for ghosts with equipment for many years, said, of course, he said to me one day, when they say it's the granny coming back, who are we to say it's not, in terms of what we can establish? It's a possibility, but consciousness is a vast subject. Some people think it's actually destined always to be beyond scientific and logical and rational inquiry. Other people tell us that the human consciousness will be one of those things. The brain will be understood in the next 20 years, and we'll soon be able to upload our brains into computers. Wide range of views. Since I'm still holding my breath from the household servant robots that were predicted in the 1980s, I don't think we're going to crack consciousness any time. But maybe we need to look more about relationships in these situations. We're talking about different awareness of how human consciousness works, and to an extent, our scientific paradigms, whatever else, should not be thrown away. But what it should be is used to try and expand our understanding of what is going on, because these phenomena have been around for a very long time, and science itself, scientific endeavours, realistically, compared with the time people have been reporting ghosts, we can't really begrudge ourselves the lack of progress, since science itself only really goes back, Western science goes back about 350 years, to the 17th century. The word scientist was only coined in 1848. One of the people who hated it apparently was Faraday. But we're talking about much wider questions, which again tie up with much of the historic work of the Society for Psychical Research, the cultural interests of members of the Ghost Club, and there's a much wider issue of emotional programming. This is a problem you'll run into typically with photographs of alleged ghosts. All too often people have not seen a ghost these days, but what they have is a fuzzy image, which they assure you is a ghost. And quite often their insistence is impervious to any kind of rational assessment. Well, if we had good ghost photographs, I might well be more in favour of ghost photography. I accept there is a possibility of equipment breakdown, but when you get into photography, just claiming that a blurred image represents a ghost is, I'm afraid, not in my view, a very well-established thing. And finally, there's some good news and some bad news about ghosts. I think there's a good chance everybody in the room will get to see a ghost at least once in their life. There's a good chance, put it that way. Good news, yes, we could all be on course to seeing ghosts, but look at recent clinical studies. Bad news, you may well be dying at the time. Deathbed experiences have become a new area in the last 3 years for people to look into in terms of the dying, the experience of the dying. Now, again, there is a large amount of collected and anecdotal spontaneous cases of things happening around the point of death. But that, of course, is a very hard one to bring into existing scientific paradigms, because we don't understand a whole lot of natural processes to do with death and dying and the brain and so forth. But so that there is a good chance we will get to eventually see a ghost, but the problem then will be communicating the results afterwards, which takes us into different aspects of survival.